I had nothing when Sophia Sterling left me. No money, no successful company, no powerful family standing behind me. Just a broken dream, an empty bank account, and the woman I had loved for 3 years walking away from me. Sophia was the daughter of billionaire businessman Richard Sterling. I was struggling to build a small technology company from nothing. We came from completely different worlds. But for 3 years, I believed love could make that difference disappear. When we first met, Sophia never treated me like I was beneath her. She didn't care that I drove an old car. She didn't care that I lived in a tiny apartment. She didn't care that my company was barely surviving. "You work harder than anyone I know," she once told me. I smiled. "And you still like me?" She laughed. "I like you because you're you." Those words meant everything to me. I believed her. Whenever my business struggled, Sophia encouraged me. Whenever I worked until 3 in the morning, she brought me coffee. "You're going to make it," she would say. "One day, everyone will know your name." I believed that too. Then my company collapsed. Our biggest client canceled their contract. 2 investors withdrew. Bills began piling up. Within weeks, I couldn't pay my employees. I had to let most of them go. Eventually, I closed the office. The sign bearing my company's name came down from the wall. I stood outside the empty building with a box containing everything I had left. My dream was gone. I called Sophia. She answered immediately. "Are you okay?" "No." She came to see me that evening. I told her everything. I lost the company. She looked at me with sadness. "We'll figure something out." I smiled weakly. "You still believe in me?" "Of course." But things changed after Richard found out. He called Sophia to his office. I wasn't there, but she later told me what happened. Her father showed her financial reports. Bills. Debts. The failed company. Then he said something that changed everything. "If you stay with him, you'll destroy your future." Sophia argued. "He's going to rebuild." Richard shook his head. "You don't know that. I know him. You know the man you wanted to become." Sophia remained silent. Richard continued. "You were born into a family that has spent generations building something. Are you really prepared to throw all of it away for someone who can't even keep his own company alive?" Those words frightened her. I could see it the next time we met. She looked different, distant, uncertain. I reached for her hand. She pulled it away. "What happened?" She looked down. "My father wants me to end this." "And what do you want?" She didn't answer. "Sophia, I don't know anymore." I felt something break inside me. "You said you'd stay." "I know." "You said money didn't matter." "I know." "Then what changed?" She finally looked at me. "I can't live like this." My heart stopped. "Like what?" "Uncertainty." She wiped away a tear. "I don't want to spend my life worrying about bills. I don't want to watch the person I love struggle every day." "I'll fix it." "You don't know if you can." "I will." "But what if you don't?" I stared at her. "So that's what this is about." She started crying. "I need security. I thought I was enough." "You are." "No." My voice broke. "I'm not." She shook her head. "That's not what I meant." "But that's what you're saying." Silence filled the room. Then she whispered the words I had been terrified to hear. "I can't continue living a poor and uncertain life." I looked at her. For 3 years, I had believed she would stay beside me through anything. Apparently, I was wrong. She stood. "I hope someday you understand." I laughed bitterly. "Understand what?" "That I loved you." "Loved?" She closed her eyes. "I still do." "Then stay." She couldn't. She walked toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back at me. For a moment, I thought she might change her mind. She didn't. The door closed. I sat alone in the apartment. The silence was unbearable. Everything I had built was gone, and now the woman I loved was gone too. I looked at the empty desk in front of me. My old laptop was still there. The screen was cracked. The battery barely worked. But underneath the grief, one thought remained. For months, I had been working secretly on a final idea. An idea I hadn't told anyone about. Not Sophia. Not Richard. Not even my former investors. It was risky. Almost impossible. But if I could make it work, it could change everything. I opened the laptop. The prototype appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long time. Sophia had left because I had nothing. Maybe she was right. Maybe I really was a failure. But as I began typing, something inside me changed. I wasn't going to build this company to win her back. I wasn't going to prove Richard wrong. I wasn't even going to become rich. I was going to build it because I needed to know whether I could become the man I believed I could be. Sophia had walked away believing my story was over. She didn't know it yet. Neither did I. But that broken laptop contained the first chapter of the life I was about to build. After Sophia left me, I hit the lowest point in my life. I had almost no money. My company was gone. My investors had disappeared. And the woman I had spent 3 years loving had decided that my future was too uncertain to share. For several days, I barely left my apartment. I stopped answering calls. I stopped opening emails. Even the laptop that had once represented my dreams felt like a reminder of everything I had failed to accomplish. Then Daniel showed up. He knocked 3 times. I didn't answer. He knocked again. Open the door. I don't want to talk. Too bad. I heard him sigh outside. You're not going to disappear on me. I finally opened the door. Daniel looked at me and immediately understood. You look terrible. I feel terrible. He stepped inside. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, You lost Sophia. I looked away. Yes, but you didn't lose yourself. I laughed bitterly. Feels like I did. No. He pointed toward the laptop on my desk. You still have that. It's worthless. Then make it worth something. I looked at him. What if I fail again? Then fail again? He shrugged. And then try again. I shook my head. You make it sound easy. It isn't easy. He sat beside me. But losing someone doesn't mean you have to lose everything else. His words stayed with me. A few days later, I rented the smallest office I could afford. It was on the 3rd floor of an old building. The elevator barely worked. The walls were cracked. There was 1 window, 2 desks, and a heating system that made strange noises at night. But it was mine. I placed my laptop on the desk. Then I started working. My final technology idea had been sitting unfinished for months. Now I had nothing else to distract me. I worked through the mornings, then the afternoons, then the nights. Sometimes I slept beside the computer because I was too exhausted to go home. Daniel brought cheap food whenever he visited. You know, he said one night, placing a bag on my desk. Normal people eat at tables. I'm not normal. I noticed. We laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in weeks. The months that followed were brutal. I contacted investors. Most rejected me immediately. One told me, You already failed once. Another said, Your company has no reputation. A third didn't even bother listening to the full presentation. Every rejection hurt. But I kept improving the product. I fixed bugs, rebuilt the interface, changed the system architecture, tested it again, and again, and again. There were nights when I wanted to quit. Then I would remember Sophia's final words. I can't continue living a poor and uncertain life. At first, those words motivated me. I wanted to become successful enough that she would regret leaving me. But slowly, something changed. One night, around 3 in the morning, I looked at the latest version of my product. The system ran perfectly. I tested it again. Perfect. I leaned back in my chair. For several seconds, I didn't move. Then I laughed. I had done it, not because Sophia would see it, not because Richard would regret underestimating me, not because Alexander would ever know my name. I had done it because I refused to believe that failure was the measure of my worth. I looked at the screen. I wasn't worthless. I whispered. I had simply lost, and losing wasn't the same as being defeated. Meanwhile, Sophia's life was moving in the opposite direction. Her family had introduced her to Alexander Kane. He was wealthy, successful, confident, everything Richard wanted in a future son-in-law. Alexander owned several businesses and came from a powerful family. He was polite to Sophia. He knew how to impress her parents. He knew exactly what to say at formal dinners. And soon, the engagement was announced. I learned about it from a business article. The headline appeared on my screen. Billionaire heiress Sophia Sterling engaged to businessman Alexander Kane. I stared at the photograph. Sophia was smiling. Alexander stood beside her. The ring on her finger caught the light. For a moment, The room became completely silent. Daniel saw the screen. He didn't say anything. I closed the article. "It's over," I said. He looked at me. "What is?" "The old life." I turned back toward my computer. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to call her. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want to beg. I didn't want to ask whether she still loved me. She had chosen her path. Now I had to choose mine. I opened the prototype again. The system was waiting for me. There were still problems to solve. There were investors to convince. There were years of work ahead. But something inside me had changed. Sophia had once been the center of my world. Now she was becoming part of my past. Not because I stopped loving her overnight, but because I was finally learning that my life had to be bigger than the person who chose to leave it. Daniel stood beside my desk. "You ready?" I looked at the screen. Then I smiled. "Let's build something." 3 years passed. 3 years since Sophia walked away. 3 years since I had sat alone in that tiny office and promised myself I would build something with my own hands. The company grew faster than I expected. Our technology attracted investors. International clients started contacting us. We expanded into several countries. What had started with a borrowed laptop and a nearly empty bank account became a serious international business. Eventually, I became financially successful, but I never forgot what it had felt like to have nothing. I remembered the empty apartment, the unpaid bills, the investors who had laughed at my ideas, and most of all, the moment Sophia told me she couldn't live a poor and uncertain life. Those memories kept me grounded. I could afford expensive cars now. I could live in a luxury apartment. I could walk into rooms filled with billionaires and belong there. But I never forgot the man who had once eaten cheap meals beside a broken computer. That man had built everything, and I respected him. Throughout those 3 years, I deliberately stayed away from Sophia. I never searched for her. I never contacted her. I never attended events where I knew her family would be present. I didn't want revenge. I simply wanted peace. Then one day, I received an invitation to one of the largest business summits in the country. My company had been invited as one of the keynote technology firms. I accepted. I didn't know the Sterling family was one of the event's biggest sponsors. When I arrived at the venue, I noticed the Sterling logo displayed throughout the entrance. For a moment, I considered leaving. Then I smiled. 3 years ago, seeing that name would have broken me. Now it was just a logo. I walked into the main hall. Executives surrounded me. Investors introduced themselves. Business leaders shook my hand. A journalist asked for an interview. I had become someone people wanted to meet. Then I saw her. Sophia. She stood across the room beside several members of her family. Her eyes met mine. She froze. I watched the shock spread across her face. She barely recognized me. The broken man she had left behind was gone. I was standing there in a tailored suit, surrounded by respected business leaders, speaking confidently about a company I had built from nothing. Sophia stared at me for several seconds. Then she walked toward me. "Can we talk?" I nodded politely. We stepped into a quieter hallway. She looked at me. "You've changed. It's been 3 years." "I know." She looked down. "I heard about your company. I'm glad. I'm proud of you. Thank you." My calmness seemed to confuse her. "I owe you an apology." I remained silent. "For leaving. You don't have to apologize." "But I hurt you." "Yes." Her eyes filled with emotion. "Do you hate me?" I looked at her. "No." She seemed relieved. Then I continued. "I simply stopped waiting for you." Her expression changed instantly. Those words hurt her more than anger could have. She looked away. "I didn't know how to come back." "You didn't need to." She looked at me. "What do you mean?" "You made your choice." She swallowed. "I thought you would hate me. I did for a while." She looked surprised. But eventually, I realized something. "What?" I couldn't spend my life waiting for someone who had already chosen another life. Her eyes became wet. "I never stopped thinking about you." I didn't respond. Before she could say anything else, a voice interrupted us. "Sophia." "Alexander." He approached with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked at me, then at Sophia. "Everything okay?" Sophia nodded. "Yes." Alexander extended his hand. "I don't believe we've properly met." We shook hands. He studied me carefully. I've heard a lot about your company. Hopefully good things. He smiled. Mostly. I could see the suspicion in his eyes. He knew there was history between us, and he didn't like it. Sophia stood beside him, but her attention remained on me. Alexander noticed. So, you're the entrepreneur everyone has been talking about, I suppose. Quite an impressive rise. Thank you. He nodded. Then his hand settled possessively on Sophia's shoulder. She looked uncomfortable. I stepped back. I should return to the conference. Sophia looked at me. Will I see you again? Probably. She waited for something more. I gave her a polite smile. Take care, Sophia. Then I walked away. I didn't look back, but Sophia did. She watched me disappear into the crowd. For the first time, she understood what she had lost. Not my money, not my company, not the success standing behind my name. She had lost the man who once would have done anything to keep her. And now that man was gone. That night, Sophia sat alone in her hotel room. She removed her jewelry and placed it on the table. Then she stared at herself in the mirror. She had everything people dreamed about. Wealth, status, a powerful family, a successful husband. Yet the one thing she couldn't stop thinking about was a man who had looked at her calmly and said, I simply stopped waiting for you. For the first time, Sophia wondered whether leaving me had been the biggest mistake of her life. And somewhere else in the same city, Alexander was asking himself an even more dangerous question. Who had I become? And why was his wife looking at me as though she had just realized she had lost something she could never buy back? While my company continued growing, the Sterling Empire began to weaken. At first, the problems were small enough to hide. A few investments performed badly. One project was delayed. A major client demanded new terms. Richard dismissed all of it as temporary. We've survived worse, he told his executives. But the losses continued. One risky international investment collapsed completely. Then another. Within months, Sterling Industries was carrying enormous debt. A major international deal that Richard had spent years negotiating suddenly fell apart. The announcement sent shockwaves through the business world. Shares dropped. Investors became nervous. Banks began demanding stronger guarantees. For the first time in decades, Richard Sterling didn't have an answer. Sophia tried to help. She attended meetings, reviewed financial reports, spoke with executives, but what she discovered frightened her. The company was far weaker than she had ever realized. There were debts everywhere. Several divisions were barely profitable. Some assets had been used as collateral for loans. Sophia stared at one financial report for several minutes. How did this happen? Her father's chief financial officer looked uncomfortable. Your father believed the investments would recover. But they didn't. No. Sophia remembered something Richard had told her years earlier. Choose someone wealthy. Your future will always be secure. She had believed him. She had believed wealth was protection. Now she was watching that protection disappear. Alexander initially promised to help. Don't worry, he told Sophia. We'll find a solution. She trusted him. But Alexander's own business was quietly struggling. Several of his investments were losing money. His family was trying to keep those problems hidden. When Richard finally approached him directly, Alexander's response was different from what Sophia expected. We need your family's support, Richard said. Alexander remained silent. An emergency investment could stabilize Sterling. I can't. Richard frowned. Why not? Because it would damage my family's position. You promised to help. I said I would try. Richard's expression hardened. You married my daughter. Alexander's face changed. Don't use Sophia to pressure me. Richard stared at him. You're refusing to help the family that welcomed you? Alexander stood. I have a business to protect. He walked away. Sophia heard the entire conversation. For years, she had believed Alexander represented security. Now, when her family actually needed help, he was protecting himself. That night, Sophia sat alone in her apartment. She remembered the past. Her father's office. His confident voice. His certainty. Choose a wealthy man, and you'll never have to worry about your future. She looked around the luxurious room. For the first time, the expensive furniture didn't make her feel safe. It made her feel trapped. She thought about me, about the tiny apartment I had lived in, the broken laptop, the cheap meals, the company I had built from nothing. and the man who had never once asked her family for money. Sophia closed her eyes. She remembered the day she left me. I can't continue living a poor and uncertain life. The words returned with painful clarity. Now she understood something she hadn't understood then. Money could disappear. Companies could collapse. Investments could fail. But loyalty was different. Loyalty remained when everything else was gone. She picked up her phone. For several minutes, she stared at my contact. She hadn't called me in years. Her finger hovered over my name. Then she pressed call. My phone rang while I was working late at the office. I glanced at the screen. Sophia Sterling. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Her name had once been the most important thing in my world. Now it was a memory I had carefully placed behind me. The phone continued ringing. I didn't answer immediately. Daniel noticed. "Who is it?" I turned the screen toward him. He stared. "Sophia." I nodded. "After all these years?" "I don't know." The phone stopped. A message appeared. "Please call me. It's important." I stared at it. Old emotions returned before I could stop them. I remembered her smile, her voice, the cafe, the wedding, and then I remembered the apartment after she left, the empty bank account, the humiliation, the nights when I had wondered whether I was worthless. She had walked away when I had nothing. Now she was calling because her family had lost something. I put the phone down. Daniel watched me carefully. "You don't have to answer." "I know, but you want to." I looked at Sophia's message. "I don't know what I want." Daniel nodded. "Then don't decide tonight." I leaned back in my chair. Part of me wanted to call her. Part of me wanted to know whether she was okay. But another part remembered the most painful lesson of my life. When I had nothing, Sophia had chosen security. Now that her security was disappearing, she was calling me. I didn't know whether she wanted me, or whether she simply needed someone who could save her. And that distinction mattered more than anything. I picked up the phone again. Her name was still on the screen. My heart wanted to answer. My memory told me to be careful. For the first time in years, Sophia had reached for me, and I had to decide whether opening that door would mean compassion, or allowing the past to hurt me all over again. Sophia finally came to my office. When my assistant told me she was waiting outside, I stared at the door for several seconds. I had imagined seeing her again countless times. In some versions, I told her everything I had wanted to say. In others, I walked away without looking at her. But when she actually entered, none of those fantasies mattered. She looked different. Sophia was still dressed in expensive clothes. Her handbag probably cost more than my first car. Her jewelry still carried the Sterling name, but none of that could hide the fear in her eyes. She sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "I need your help." I already knew what she meant. Sterling is in trouble. She nodded. "We're running out of options, and you want me to save it." Her eyes filled with tears. "Yes." I leaned back in my chair. For years, I had dreamed about the Sterling family coming to me for help. But now that it was happening, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. I looked at Sophia. Then I asked the one question that had lived inside me for years. "Where were you when I needed help?" Her face changed. "I know." "No." My voice remained calm. "You don't know." I looked down at my desk. When my company failed, I had nothing. No investors. No money. No future. She lowered her head. "And you left." "I was afraid. You told me you couldn't live a poor and uncertain life." Tears began falling down her cheeks. "I know. You didn't believe I could rebuild. I was wrong. You didn't even stay long enough to find out." She covered her face. "I regret it every day." I remained silent. "I was afraid of poverty," she whispered. "I was afraid of losing everything I had grown up with. My father convinced me that security was more important than love." She looked at me, and I believed him. I felt the anger I had buried for years rising again. "You made your choice." "I know. Then you have to live with it." "I am." She wiped her tears. "But thousands of people are going to suffer if Sterling collapses." That stopped me. "How many?" "Thousands directly. More through our suppliers and partners." I looked away. That was the problem. I hated Richard. I hated what he had done to me. I hated the way he had treated me like I was worthless. But those employees hadn't done anything to me. They weren't responsible for Richard's decisions. They shouldn't lose their jobs because I wanted revenge. Sophia continued. Some of them have worked there their entire lives. I closed my eyes. I remembered what it had felt like to lose my own company. The employees who had trusted me. The people who had families depending on their salaries. I knew exactly what a collapse could do. I can't save Richard's pride, I finally said. Sophia looked up. I understand. I mean it. I know. If I get involved, it won't be because of your father. She nodded. I won't ask you to forgive him. It won't be because of you either. Her expression fell slightly. I continued. It will be because innocent people shouldn't pay for the mistakes of powerful men. Sophia nodded through her tears. Then you'll help? I'll examine the company. Hope appeared in her eyes. But I haven't agreed to save it. She nodded quickly. That's enough. I stood and walked toward the window. Send me everything. Financial statements? Everything. Contracts? All of them. Debt records? Yes. She hesitated. Thank you. I turned toward her. Don't thank me yet. She nodded. I looked at her carefully. If the company can be saved without protecting your father's ego, I'll find a way. And if it can't, then I won't pretend otherwise. She stood. I understand. She reached the door. Then she stopped. I never expected you to help me after what I did. I didn't answer. She turned back. I don't deserve it. Maybe not. Her eyes filled with tears again. But the employees do. She nodded. Then she walked out. I remained alone in my office. Daniel entered a few minutes later. You're really going to help them? I'll investigate. Why? Because innocent people shouldn't lose everything. He studied me. And Richard? I looked toward the door Sophia had just walked through. Richard can face the consequences of his choices. Daniel smiled faintly. 3 years ago you wanted revenge. I know. What changed? I looked at the city outside my window. I realized revenge would make me successful at becoming someone I don't want to be. Daniel nodded. So, what are you going to do? I picked up the sterling financial documents Sophia had left behind. Save the people. I paused. Not the empire. For the first time, I understood that power wasn't about destroying the people who had hurt you. Sometimes it was having enough power to help them and still refusing to become their servant. Sophia had come to me because her world was collapsing. I didn't know what would happen between us. I didn't know whether I could ever trust her again. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let thousands of innocent employees fall just because I had once been hurt. If Sterling survived, it would survive because its people deserved a future. Not because Richard Sterling deserved to keep his empire. Daniel and I spent the next several days investigating Sterling Technologies' finances. At first, the numbers looked like a disaster caused by bad investments. Millions had disappeared into failing projects. Several international deals had collapsed. Debt had increased dramatically. But something about the records bothered me. The losses were too organized, too consistent. Look at this, Daniel said one night. He pointed at a series of transactions. Money moved from the main company into these accounts. I studied the documents. The accounts belonged to companies that officially had nothing to do with Sterling. But when we traced the ownership structure, we found the same name appearing repeatedly. Victor Hayes. Victor had been Richard's trusted financial advisor for more than a decade. He had access to nearly everything: financial reports, investment accounts, internal transfers, board documents. Daniel looked at me. He's been stealing from them. Not just stealing. I opened another report. He's been manipulating their financial statements. The real picture was worse than we expected. Victor had secretly moved company money into hidden accounts and created false reports that made Sterling appear healthier than it actually was. Then, when investments began failing, he used the confusion to hide the missing funds. This isn't a financial crisis, Daniel said. It's fraud. I nodded. But Victor wasn't the only person hiding something. We discovered communications involving Alexander. He had known that Sterling was struggling. He had also known about several irregular financial transactions. Yet he said nothing. Why? The answer became clear when we examined his private communications. Alexander had wanted the Sterling family to become financially dependent on him. He believed that once Richard lost enough money, the family would have no choice but to rely on Kane Capital. He could then control Sterling through its debt. He wasn't protecting Sophia. He wasn't protecting her family. He was positioning himself to own them. I called Alexander. He agreed to meet. We met in a private conference room. He walked in with the same confidence I remembered from the summit. "You've been investigating my business. I've been investigating Sterling. You should stop." I placed a folder on the table. Victor Hayes moved Sterling money into hidden accounts. Alexander's expression barely changed. "And you knew Sterling was in trouble." Silence. "You knew about the financial problems before Sophia did." He leaned forward. "You don't understand how business works." "I understand enough. You're interfering with things that don't concern you. They concern thousands of employees." Alexander's expression hardened. "You think your money makes you untouchable?" "No." I looked directly at him. "I think evidence does." For the first time, his confidence disappeared. "You have no idea what you're getting involved in." "That's a threat." "It's advice." I stood. "Then here's mine." I placed another document on the table. "Don't threaten me again." I walked out. I didn't confront him publicly. I didn't insult him. I didn't retaliate. I simply collected evidence. Because I had learned something during the years I spent rebuilding my life. Anger could make you feel powerful. Evidence actually made you powerful. When Sophia learned the truth, she was devastated. She sat silently in my office as I explained everything. "You're saying Alexander knew?" "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." She covered her mouth. "I married him because I thought he could give me security." Her voice broke. "And he was planning to take what little security my family had left." I didn't answer. Sophia looked at the floor. I was so wrong. I said nothing. She began crying. Not because she had lost money, because she finally understood what her marriage had really been. She had chosen wealth over love, and the wealth she trusted had been built on people who were willing to use her. Richard eventually joined us. For the first time, I saw no arrogance in his expression, only exhaustion. "I trusted Victor," he said. "You trusted too many people," I replied. He looked at me. "I thought I could control everything." "You couldn't." "I know." He sat down heavily. "My obsession with status destroyed my judgment." Sophia looked at him. "You destroyed more than the company." Richard lowered his head. "I know." I placed a restructuring proposal on the table. "There is still a way to save Sterling." Richard looked at the documents. "How?" "Debt restructuring, asset sales, removal of compromised executives, independent financial oversight." He turned the pages. "And who controls the company?" "You don't." His eyes narrowed. "What? You need to surrender executive control?" Richard stood. "Absolutely not." I remained calm. "If you keep control, the company will collapse." "You expect me to hand over my family business?" "You already lost control." His face hardened. "No. You're choosing pride over survival. This company carries my family's name, and that name won't mean anything if the company disappears." Silence filled the room. Sophia looked at her father. "Dad." Richard didn't respond. I continued. "You can keep your title if that's what you need." He looked at me. "But the decisions have to be made by professionals who aren't protecting their egos." Richard stared at the proposal. For years, he had been the most powerful person in every room. Now he was sitting across from the man he had once declared unworthy of his daughter. And that man was the only person offering a way forward. "If I refuse?" Richard asked quietly. I looked him directly in the eyes. "Then Sterling disappears." He looked towards Sophia, then at the documents. For the first time, Richard Sterling had no powerful argument left. No wealth could solve this. No family connection could hide it. No reputation could repair it. He finally had to listen, and for the first time, the future of Sterling would depend not on the richest person in the room, but on the person willing to make the hardest choices. I took control of the restructuring process the following morning. It was one of the strangest moments of my life. 3 years earlier, I had stood outside my own failed company with a box of belongings in my hands. Now I was sitting at the head of a conference table inside Sterling Technologies, surrounded by executives who had once considered me beneath them. Richard sat across from me. He rarely spoke. I could tell he was struggling with the reality of the situation. The man he had once dismissed as worthless was now responsible for saving the company he had spent his entire life building. But I wasn't interested in humiliating him. I had a different goal. The employees. My team immediately began reviewing every department. We froze unnecessary spending, renegotiated debt agreements, sold non-essential assets, canceled projects that were draining money. Most importantly, we protected the employees who had nothing to do with the company's mistakes. I refused to begin with mass layoffs. These people didn't steal the money, I told the board. They shouldn't pay for someone else's crimes. Sophia worked beside me. That surprised me. She didn't sit in an executive office waiting for reports. She visited employees. She walked through departments. She listened to complaints. One afternoon, she spent nearly 2 hours speaking with workers whose salaries had been delayed. "I know my family failed you," she told them. An older employee looked at her. "Are you going to fix it?" Sophia didn't make a promise she couldn't keep. "I'll do everything I can." That answer mattered. She was finally learning the difference between leadership and authority. A leader didn't simply give orders. A leader accepted responsibility. Weeks passed. The company slowly stabilized. Then Alexander made one final attempt to destroy me. False information about my company appeared online. The reports claimed that I had manipulated Sterling's restructuring to acquire its assets illegally. The accusations spread quickly. Investors began asking questions. Daniel called me immediately. "This came from inside the Kane network. Can you prove it? Give me a few hours." He didn't need much longer. Daniel traced the information back to a private communications channel connected to Alexander's remaining business associates. They had deliberately leaked false documents to damage my reputation. We released the evidence publicly. The story changed overnight. Instead of damaging my company, Alexander exposed himself. Business partners abandoned him. Investors withdrew. The reputation he had spent years building collapsed in days. Soon, Alexander left the city. No dramatic goodbye. No powerful celebration. Just a man disappearing after finally facing the consequences of his choices. I didn't celebrate. I had learned that destroying someone wasn't the same as winning. One evening, Sophia came to my office. She stood near the window for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why?" I looked at her. "Why what? Why did you help us?" I didn't answer immediately. She continued. "You could have destroyed my family. Yes. You could have taken Sterling for yourself. I could have. You had every reason to walk away." I looked toward the city. "Your father hurt me." "I know. You hurt me too." Her eyes filled with tears. "I know. But the employees didn't." She remained silent. I turned toward her. "Because I know what it feels like when everyone decides you're not worth saving." Sophia's eyes filled completely. When my company failed, people looked at me like I was a failure. She listened. They didn't care how hard I had worked. They only saw what I had lost. I paused. I didn't want Sterling's employees to experience the same thing. Sophia wiped away a tear. "You became the person I thought you could never become." I smiled slightly. "No." She looked confused. "I became the person I needed to become." She stepped closer. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to." "I do." "No." I looked directly at her. "If you really want to thank me, lead this company properly." She nodded. "I will. Not for your father." "I know. Not for your family's reputation." "I know." "Then why?" She smiled through her tears. "For the people who depend on it." I nodded. "That's enough." Sophia stood quietly beside me. For the first time, there was no billionaire heiress and struggling entrepreneur between us. No family name, no money, no social class. Just two people who had survived very different kinds of loss. She had once believed wealth determined who was worth loving. I had once believed rejection determined whether I was worth anything. We were both wrong. Money could create opportunities. Power could open doors. But neither could create character. That had to be earned. And as I watched Sophia walk through the company the next morning, speaking with employees and taking responsibility for her family's mistakes, I realized something. I hadn't only saved Sterling. I had saved myself from becoming bitter. I had been given the perfect opportunity to take revenge. Instead, I chose to become better than the people who had hurt me, and that was a kind of victory no amount of money could buy. A year later, Sterling Technologies was stable again. It wasn't the unstoppable empire it had once been, and that was exactly what made the recovery meaningful. The company had fewer unnecessary divisions, less debt, stronger financial controls. Most importantly, it had people running it who understood that a company wasn't just a number on a balance sheet. Sophia had become one of those people. She was no longer simply Richard Sterling's daughter. She was a business leader in her own right. She had earned the respect of employees who had once doubted her. She made difficult decisions herself. She accepted responsibility when things went wrong. And she refused to return to the life where money determined every decision. One evening, Sophia asked me to meet her at a small restaurant. I knew the place immediately. It was the restaurant where we used to eat when we had almost no money. The tables were simple. The food was inexpensive. The walls had barely changed. When I arrived, Sophia was already sitting at our old table. She smiled. I thought you'd remember. I couldn't forget this place. She looked around. We used to come here because it was all we could afford. And you never complained. She laughed. I actually loved it. We ordered the same dishes we used to share years ago. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Work, Daniel, the company, life. Then Sophia became quiet. There is something I need to tell you. I looked at her. She took a breath. I finally understand what I lost. I waited. When I left you, I thought I was giving up uncertainty. She looked down. I thought I was choosing a secure future. She smiled sadly. But I was really giving up someone who loved me when I had everything. I said nothing, and then I lost the wealth I thought would protect me. Her eyes met mine. That was when I understood. Understood what? Security isn't something you inherit. She paused. It's something two people build together. I looked at her carefully. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't trying to rewrite history. I don't want you to forget what happened, she said. I won't. I know. I don't think I ever could. I don't want you to. Her voice was calm. I want to build something new with you. My heart tightened. If you're willing. I looked away. There were so many things I wanted to say. Instead, I told her the truth. I still love you. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. But I'm afraid. She reached for my hand, but stopped before touching it. Of what? Being abandoned again. Her expression softened. I understand. You said you'd stay before. I know. And then you left when everything became difficult. I know. I can't survive that again. She slowly reached across the table. This time, I allowed her to take my hand. I can't promise that life will always be easy, she said. I know. I can't promise we'll never argue. I know. I can't promise we'll never be afraid. I smiled slightly. Then what can you promise? She looked directly into my eyes. This time, if you lose everything, I will still choose you. I froze. Those words were simple, but they meant more now, because Sophia had already experienced what it was like to lose everything. She had lived without her family's wealth. She had worked from the bottom. She had discovered that money could disappear overnight. And yet she had still chosen to come back to me. Not because I was successful, not because I was rich, but because she had finally learned what mattered. I squeezed her hand. I believe you. She smiled through her tears. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I laughed quietly. What happened to the woman who couldn't live a poor and uncertain life? Sophia laughed through her tears. She learned that uncertainty is better when you're facing it with the right person. I smiled. That sounds more like you. We stayed there for hours. There was no dramatic proposal, no expensive ring, no announcement to the world. Just two people sitting at a cheap restaurant, holding hands. We knew the future wouldn't be perfect. There would be arguments, business problems, family complications, fear, difficult decisions. But for the first time, neither of us was trying to create a perfect future. We were willing to create a real one. Before we left, Sophia stood beside me outside the restaurant. Are you sure? I looked at her. About us? She nodded. I smiled. No. She looked surprised. I'm not sure about anything. Then I took her hand. But I'm willing to try. Her eyes filled with tears again. That's enough. We walked down the street together. No one followed us. No cameras. No reporters. No powerful families deciding our future. Just Sophia and me. And as we walked, I realized something. Years ago, I had loved Sophia because I believed she would never leave me. Now I love her despite knowing that life could change everything. That was the difference. I wasn't choosing her because I needed her. She wasn't choosing me because she needed saving. We were choosing each other because we wanted to, and this time, our promise wasn't that life would never become difficult. It was something much simpler. Neither of us would run when it did. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of loving Sophia again, because I finally understood that loving someone didn't mean giving them control over your worth. I had learned who I was without her. She had learned who she was without her family's money. Now, if we walked forward together, we would do it as equals. Not heiress and outsider. Not rich and poor. Not savior and victim. Just two people who had lost each other, grown apart, and somehow found their way back. This time, we weren't promising forever. We were promising to stay when forever became difficult. Years later, I still remember the day Sophia abandoned me when I had nothing. For a long time, that memory was painful. I remember the tiny apartment, the empty bank account, the failed company, the woman I loved standing in front of me and telling me she couldn't continue living a poor and uncertain life. Back then, I believed losing Sophia was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I was wrong. Losing her became the beginning of discovering myself. If she had stayed, maybe I would have continued believing that my worth depended on someone else's choice. Maybe I would have spent my life trying to prove myself to Richard Sterling. Maybe I would have built my company simply to make Sophia regret leaving. Instead, I built it because I needed to prove something to myself. That I could fall and still stand. That failure didn't define me. That being rejected didn't make me worthless. And eventually, I understood that success wasn't the real victory. Self-respect was. Sophia and I built a new relationship slowly. There were no shortcuts. Trust had to be earned. Honesty became more important than romance. Neither of us hid difficult feelings anymore. When something hurt, we talked about it. When we disagreed, we didn't run. When life became difficult, we stayed. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, it was equal. Sophia was no longer simply an heiress. She had become an independent business leader. I was no longer the struggling man her family had looked down on. But neither of us cared about those labels anymore. We were simply Sophia and me. Richard changed too. He became quieter with age. The man who had once believed he could control every part of his daughter's future finally learned to respect her choices. Sometimes he would ask my opinion about business. The first time it happened, Daniel nearly laughed when I told him, "Richard Sterling asking you for advice?" I smiled. Apparently the world really did change. The Sterling Company survived, but its culture changed completely. Employees were treated as people rather than numbers. Management became more transparent. Executives were held accountable. Profit remained important, but it was no longer the only thing that mattered. Sophia often told me that the biggest lesson she had learned was that a company could recover from financial losses more easily than it could recover from a loss of trust. I agreed. One evening, Sophia and I sat together at home. She looked at me with a small smile. "Do you still remember the day I begged you to save my family?" I laughed. "How could I forget?" She leaned against me. I was terrified. "I know. I thought everything was going to disappear." It almost did. She became quiet. Then she asked, "What do you remember most clearly?" I thought about it. Surprisingly, it wasn't the day she came to my office. It wasn't the day Sterling nearly collapsed. It wasn't even the wedding. There was another memory. One sentence. I looked at her. "I remember the day you told me I wasn't enough." Sophia's expression changed. "I was wrong." "Yes." She took my hand. "I was so wrong." I smiled. "You were wrong." She looked at me. "But you know what?" "What?" "I was always enough." Her eyes filled with tears. "I just needed to believe it myself." Sophia squeezed my hand. "And now I know how lucky I am that you chose to forgive me." I looked at her. "I didn't forgive you because I forgot." "I know." I forgave you because I didn't want the past controlling my future anymore. She rested her head against my shoulder. I understand. We sat quietly together. I thought about everything that had happened. The failed company, the tiny office, the nights I spent working beside my computer, the investors who rejected me, the first successful product, the business summit where Sophia barely recognized me, the collapse of the Sterling Empire, her tears, Richard's apology, Alexander's betrayal, the restructuring, the second chance. All of it had led here, and I finally understood something. My greatest victory wasn't becoming richer than the people who had once looked down on me. It wasn't building a global company. It wasn't watching Sophia regret leaving me. It wasn't proving Richard wrong. My greatest victory was becoming someone who no longer needed anyone's regret to feel valuable. Sophia could have regretted me forever. Richard could have apologized 1,000 times. None of that would have mattered if I still believed I wasn't enough. The real change happened when I stopped asking other people to decide my worth. I had been enough before the money. I had been enough after the failure. I had been enough when Sophia left. And I was enough before she came back. That was the truth I had spent years learning. Sophia looked at me. "What are you thinking about?" I smiled. How different everything would be if I could talk to the man I was back then. "What would you tell him?" I looked at her hand in mine. "I'd tell him not to be afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing someone." She smiled. "Why?" "Because sometimes losing someone is how you finally find yourself." Sophia leaned closer. "And what about finding each other again?" I smiled. "That was the bonus." She laughed. Outside, the city lights filled the night. The world continued moving. Businesses opened. Companies grew. People succeeded and failed. But none of it mattered as much as the quiet moment between us. We had once believed love meant never letting go. Now we understood something better. Love meant choosing each other freely, respecting each other's independence, staying when life became difficult, and knowing that even if everything disappeared tomorrow, neither of us would disappear with it. I had once been terrified that Sophia leaving meant I had lost everything. Now I knew the truth. She had never been my everything. She had been part of my story. And the moment she walked away, I finally began writing my own. Years later, she came back. Not because I became rich, not because she needed saving, but because we had both become strong enough to choose love without fear. I looked at Sophia and smiled. She smiled back, and this time, there was no question of whether I was enough. I already knew the answer. I always had been. Years later, I still remember the day Sophia abandoned me when I had nothing. For a long time, that memory was painful. I remember the tiny apartment, the empty bank account, the failed company, the woman I loved standing in front of me and telling me she couldn't continue living a poor and uncertain life. Back then, I believed losing Sophia was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I was wrong. Losing her became the beginning of discovering myself. If she had stayed, maybe I would have continued believing that my worth depended on someone else's choice. Maybe I would have spent my life trying to prove myself to Richard Sterling. Maybe I would have built my company simply to make Sophia regret leaving. Instead, I built it because I needed to prove something to myself. That I could fall and still stand. That failure didn't define me. That being rejected didn't make me worthless. And eventually, I understood that success wasn't the real victory. Self-respect was. Sophia and I built a new relationship slowly. There were no shortcuts. Trust had to be earned. Honesty became more important than romance. Neither of us hid difficult feelings anymore. When something hurt, we talked about it. When we disagreed, we didn't run. When life became difficult, we stayed. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, it was equal. Sophia was no longer simply an heiress. She had become an independent business leader. I was no longer the struggling man her family had looked down on. But neither of us cared about those labels anymore. We were simply Sophia and me. Richard changed too. He became quieter with age. The man who had once believed he could control every part of his daughter's future finally learned to respect her choices. Sometimes he would ask my opinion about business. The first time it happened, Daniel nearly laughed when I told him, "Richard Sterling asking you for advice?" I smiled. Apparently the world really did change. The Sterling company survived, but its culture changed completely. Employees were treated as people rather than numbers. Management became more transparent. Executives were held accountable. Profit remained important, but it was no longer the only thing that mattered. Sophia often told me that the biggest lesson she had learned was that a company could recover from financial losses more easily than it could recover from a loss of trust. I agreed. One evening, Sophia and I sat together at home. She looked at me with a small smile. "Do you still remember the day I begged you to save my family?" I laughed. "How could I forget?" She leaned against me. I was terrified. "I know. I thought everything was going to disappear." It almost did. She became quiet. Then she asked, "What do you remember most clearly?" I thought about it. Surprisingly, it wasn't the day she came to my office. It wasn't the day Sterling nearly collapsed. It wasn't even the wedding. There was another memory. One sentence. I looked at her. "I remember the day you told me I wasn't enough." Sophia's expression changed. "I was wrong." "Yes." She took my hand. "I was so wrong." I smiled. "You were wrong." She looked at me. "But you know what?" "What?" "I was always enough." Her eyes filled with tears. "I just needed to believe it myself." Sophia squeezed my hand. "And now I know how lucky I am that you chose to forgive me." I looked at her. "I didn't forgive you because I forgot." "I know. I forgave you because I didn't want the past controlling my future anymore." She rested her head against my shoulder. "I understand." We sat quietly together. I thought about everything that had happened. The failed company, the tiny office, the nights I spent working beside my computer, the investors who rejected me, the first successful product, the business summit where Sophia barely recognized me, the collapse of the Sterling Empire, her tears, Richard's apology, Alexander's betrayal, the restructuring, the second chance. All of it had led here, and I finally understood something. My greatest victory wasn't becoming richer than the people who had once looked down on me. It wasn't building a global company. It wasn't watching Sophia regret leaving me. It wasn't proving Richard wrong. My greatest victory was becoming someone who no longer needed anyone's regret to feel valuable. Sophia could have regretted me forever. Richard could have apologized 1,000 times. None of that would have mattered if I still believed I wasn't enough. The real change happened when I stopped asking other people to decide my worth. I had been enough before the money. I had been enough after the failure. I had been enough when Sophia left. And I was enough before she came back. That was the truth I had spent years learning. Sophia looked at me. "What are you thinking about?" I smiled. How different everything would be if I could talk to the man I was back then. "What would you tell him?" I looked at her hand in mine. "I'd tell him not to be afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing someone." She smiled. "Why?" "Because sometimes losing someone is how you finally find yourself." Sophia leaned closer. "And what about finding each other again?" I smiled. "That was the bonus." She laughed. Outside, the city lights filled the night. The world continued moving. Businesses opened. Companies grew. People succeeded and failed. But none of it mattered as much as the quiet moment between us. We had once believed love meant never letting go. Now we understood something better. Love meant choosing each other freely, respecting each other's independence, staying when life became difficult, and knowing that even if everything disappeared tomorrow, neither of us would disappear with it. I had once been terrified that Sophia leaving meant I had lost everything. Now I knew the truth. She had never been my everything. She had been part of my story. And the moment she walked away, I finally began writing my own. Years later, she came back. Not because I became rich, not because she needed saving, but because we had both become strong enough to choose love without fear. I looked at Sophia and smiled. She smiled back, and this time, there was no question of whether I was enough. I already knew the answer. I always had been.